I think the freedoms have to be bundled together, and we need urgently to discover again those cultural roots if we're to resolve all of the other policy issues before us. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I think we're fast approaching the point where the West's greatest enemy is the West. And most of us don't identify as being on the political extremes. We're in the middle, but we're watching this tennis match go over the top of us as we brawl over just about everything that divides us and almost never talk about the things that should unite us as Australians. But one thing that should unite us lies at the very heart of our freedoms, of our prosperity, of our democratic model, I believe, and it's freedom of conscience. Now, others might want to disagree with me on this. Some people say, no, freedom of speech is the most important freedom because it's the one by which you defend all the other freedoms. Interestingly enough, was a left-wing atheist called Frank Furedi. I don't know whether any of you have read his books. Now, he's emeritus professor of psychology, I think, at Kent University. He's 77, he's Hungarian by background, but trained in England, speaks with a perfect English accent, was a student radical in the 60s, and is despairing of the way, in fact, we're closing down our young people's minds today, not expanding them. He said, we teased the boundaries, now we push the boundaries in on our kids at university, and we whole courses. And remember, this is someone from the left. He says that now this empathy culture where you're not allowed to put up offensive ideas that might challenge people is seeing whole university courses in the West designed not to encourage thinking and the exploration and seeking out of truth, but to avoid offending. And you've got academics everywhere afraid to offend because if they haven't issued a proper trigger warning, someone can complain, they'll end up in a kangaroo court, and the kid will, the university's got to provide counselling and all this sort of stuff. Now, I said to him, well, we're not like that in Australia, and he looked at me sharply and said, I know your country well. He said, your universities have picked up many of the most ridiculous and, in a very lazy way, patterns out of America and out of England. You're not, and he loves his country.
Yep.
He actually said to me, you have the largest remaining cohort, in percentage terms, of clear-thinking people in the Western world. His observation, not mine.
Yeah.
And yet, he said, your universities, sorry if there are any academics here tonight, but he said your educational institutions are not encouraging people to think for themselves, to inquire. So, but the other observation he said when I said to him, is speech our first freedom? He said, no, conscience. Freedom of conscience was the first. Came out of the Protestant Reformation, and no one should be proud of this, but there was a terrible pattern, as we know. You can see, you go to Oxford, you go to London, you can see the sites, you go to Europe, where leaders of the minority of the day were burnt at the stake. And after a while, people realised that was barbaric, certainly not Christian, and pretty dumb, because today's minority ends up being tomorrow's majority, and then suddenly you're the one being burnt at the stake. And we learnt that the way around this, the genius, I believe, of our society, rests in this idea that we have to disagree respectfully. We have to allow other people their conscience. Now, the next and most important point out of that is it's not a matter of private conscience. If your conscience informed, and we all have a conscience, we're all highly moral. If you don't think we are, try joining the mafia and steal the boss's silver and see what happens.
Yeah.
It's a question of how your conscience is informed and by what your conscience is informed. And if your conscience as a Christian informs you in a way that says you need to be active in the public space, you need to own your faith, you need to care about the poor, the oppressed, you need to care about justice and truth, then conscience, the right to freedom of conscience, is a positive right. And that's the way I think it ought to be understood.